Hello again, Dr. Tracey, Conti, Chair of the Department of Family Medicine. And it is my privilege to address you again, but this time as an introduction to our next panel. So I'm a native Pittsburgher, and I've had the privilege of growing up and hearing this voice and with Lynne Hayes-Freeland. And it's a pleasure to introduce her and the Fireside Chat that she's going to have with Dr. Ben Danielson. So Lynne began her broadcast career as the producer of the Roy Fox Show on KDKA Radio in 1976. And then she later moved to KDKA TV, where she had a variety of positions, including field producer of Evening Magazine and a producer of a variety of other public affair programs, including Weekend Magazine Vibrations and the station's annual Children's Hospital Telethon. As a local fixture in Pittsburgh media, Ms. Hayes-Freeland made history in January of 2019 when she became the first full-time African-American to host a daily talk show on KDKA Radio, the nation's first radio station. And that move came after more than 40 years at KDKA TV, where she held a variety of positions. She has had the opportunity to interview many famous people, including Nelson Mandela, Rosa Parks, James Baldwin, Maya Angelou. And so it's an honor that she's able to be with us here today, and as of Friday, being retired from on air, as I've learned with many other people who say that they're retiring, they don't truly retire. And so we are excited to have her here. I will allow her to introduce Dr. Danielson, but what I'd really like to bring to this group is how impactful he has been in this move to address systemic racism within our health system. And he's really become the face of what physicians and what one person can do in order to confront what we must do to make a change.
We need our chairs in the fireside chat position. Confronting structural racism in health systems. It's a big subject. Dr. Ben Danielson is a pediatrician, and as you've already heard, he's also a professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine. His academic credentials are already well documented: Harvard undergrad, University of Washington School of Medicine, Seattle Children's Hospital, his residency. But Dr. Danielson has also made a name for himself as a community advocate. In fact, last year in 2020, he made headlines, not just in Seattle, but across the country, when he resigned his position as medical director of the Odessa Brown Children's Clinic for one primary reason: racism. Racism woven into a medical system that did little to support his concerns for the issues or address the root causes. That's probably the perfect place for us to start our fireside chat. When we talk about racism, it is such a broad subject. It includes how medical professionals are dealt with, how use of the N-word came up at work, how patients are treated from start to finish. You didn't wake up one day and say, racism is a problem here.
That's right. Yeah, like anyone else who's worked in this field, you have these accumulation of experiences that inform who you are. But you know, I got to pause for just a second and just say how thankful I am to be on a stage with you. Yeah. And,
the honor's mine.
This fireside chat model is maybe just one way to make a hard conversation just a small amount more accessible. And one of my greatest heroes and strongest partners in addressing issues of racism in the Seattle area is another legendary Black journalist and a person of great renown in the Seattle area. She and I have been partners in a long struggle, so I feel like I'm just in the right familiar space for this fireside chat. So just
awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome.
It's so interesting how systems are made up of mostly just really good people. And they're also systems that are so informed by their history, as we've talked about, that they actually can't wrench themselves free of them. And that folks have experiences that layer upon layer upon layer become sometimes completely unbearable. And for me, personally, it wasn't my leaving the Odessa Brown Children's Clinic, because that is probably the most beautiful, wonderful clinic I could ever hope to spend time in. Serves this amazing Black community. Yes, Seattle has a Black community, and it's been just part of that cherished community for, well, since the 60s. I gave up that job, the best job I will ever have, in protest of the sponsoring hospital that owned it, Seattle Children's Hospital, the place where I trained, the place where I grew up, the place where nurses taught me how to be a doctor, the place that I found great support and mentorship, but the place that has so many deep problems with racism. I find it inspiring in so many ways to hear uplifting conversations about work being done in other places. So thank you again for having a chance to come here and hear about the wonderful and important work. I also find so many cautionary tales in what's happening right now, today, across this country, across organizations, across systems, but especially in our healthcare system as we try to address some of these hard issues.
So when you look at 2020, you look at the day you made that decision, you made that choice. You knew there would be ripples from that, but you also knew there would be personal ripples as well.
Yeah.
And many of the folks out here know that feeling. Talk them through that day. Talk them through that period.
I have felt a very personal and important responsibility to do a bit of my own reckoning. And if you're Black and you've been in healthcare, you've been exposed to your own versions of trauma, your own struggles. I am sure you could tell incredible stories from your field. There's also been times when you felt like you've worried that your role has been complicit, that there have been times when the system wants to tokenize you, or where they've wanted to pull you into compromising some of your values in order to advance other agendas. So part of my time a year ago was really doing personal reckoning about all of that. But what was infuriating to me was not about the way I'd been treated, not about the hospital leadership that used the N-word with me. It was not so much about the lack of support I'd gotten from that place as a growing leader. It was much more about the treatment of families and the ways in which the hospital was unaccountable and was unaccounted for its treatment of Black and brown families. And I mean, that's from the moment you walk through the door. The hospital was looking at its own practices and found that it was unjustly policing, calling security on families based on the color of their skin at a proportion to 2 to 3 times. Why is it always 2 to 3 times? Why is it always 3 times as many deaths? Why is it always 3 times as great a risk? Why is it so often 2 to 3 times the disparities that happen when it comes to racism? And the deeper insult to me was that that had been happening for a long time and had not been addressed, even though they knew about it. The issues that I was seeing was that this hospital serves a region that has many, many families from rural communities, many migrant families that speak Spanish, was not providing adequate services to those families, so that if you did not feel fully comfortable in English language and fully connected to white culture, you risked not knowing what was happening to your child when you brought them to this place that was supposed to be serving several states. These are not issues that are unique to one hospital. These are parts of our systems, and we need to be taking stronger stands about that. I have to say, my place was one of great privilege. I've come from a place of knowing what it's like not to have very much, and being taught how to work hard and struggle. But as a physician in this country, in this day and age, I exist with great, great privilege. So the opportunity to make a statement, to say something, to resign, to make it known, that's not necessarily something that someone should give me a whole lot of credit for, because I have great, great privilege in this nation. And it felt more like obligation.
And see, I think to me, and I don't know your whole story, I know what I've read, that is what in many ways helps define part of your story. Because if I understand correctly, it started in foster care. It started in a foster care system, is that correct?
Oh, my story?
Yes,
Oh, you're
your
going
story.
back.
I'm going back,
Sure.
right. But you see, when you talk about then that feeling of great privilege,
Yeah.
that's a big journey there.
Ooh, yeah.
That's a big journey, but for many of the very people that you are sending a message to are at the beginning of your story.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's interesting how we see privilege and how we look at it. I think I was privileged enough to be rescued by an amazing, weird, smart, hippie mom from foster care from a very, very early age. That was a sort of a privilege. I think I was privileged by being raised by a community in Washington, D.C. that knew how to teach me about blackness, about what it meant to be a black person in this country, how to survive that, but also what we often don't talk about, but the beauty and joy and amazing brilliance of black communities across this country. Can I get an amen just from Father Abernathy, maybe anybody? No, I just think there are many ways in which privilege can be measured that go beyond sometimes status, hierarchy, and dollars. I will also say that, I think we've all been victimized by the systems that we love and try to work for in so many ways. From a medical standpoint, I was in foster care as a very young baby. I think there was not a clear understanding of my heritage, so I spent the first, I think, 3 to 4 weeks of my life under phototherapy because my skin was not quite white. And so I had this experience, in a way now, looking back, of the medical system trying to cure me of my blackness from maybe those first days. Interesting. I think Deirdre made me think about that with the things that she was talking about, how we institutionalize standards and tests that are really based on whiteness or harm blackness.
So then when we talk about systemic racism, whether it is that kind of experience or the experience of a family that English is not a primary language, not knowing what's happening to their child, or that feeling of the look of disdain the receptionist gives you when you walk through the front door, that now sets the tone for the rest of your interaction. Those are all the kinds of things we're talking about, though.
It's all about the culture of care. The idea that you could be worried about your child grieving, really worried that your child's welfare is being threatened, that you need to be in a hospital, and yet how you express that grief is judged by a very narrow set of criteria, that if you don't cry enough, a social worker gets called if you're black because you don't seem to care enough about your child. If you're not there every minute because you have a job and you don't have daycare and you know your boss will fire you because they can when you're not showing up at work, then CPS gets called by the hospital because you don't seem to be caring enough to be there. If you cry too much, if you scream, if you wail, if your heart sings out with pain about the challenges, the things that are happening to the child that you love, then security gets called and you're escorted away, and maybe police come and they take you away. That is, we can talk about all of these other things, but let's make sure we bring something about the humanity and the indignity of experience and of culture and the spaces that we need to rely on the most. We need to be treated the best. We need to be able to say that person will treat me with dignity even as they take care of my child or my elder or the person I love.
So now this is the message you're trying to get across to your leadership, to the leadership of the hospital. These are a problem. This is an issue. This is one of the issues. If I can't get respect, you've got patients here. At the same time, I'm in Seattle and I'm saying, well, this is where I want to go because Dr. Danielson is there and I know it's going to be okay. So how do you even begin to get a leadership team to process that and then respond to it?
I think it's really difficult. I think it's really challenging because it's layered with so many things, but the truth of the outcomes is the truth of the outcomes, that any ER in this country, if your skin is more pigmented, if you've got appendicitis, you're not going to get as much pain medicine. You're actually not going to get the imaging studies you need. If you're black and brown, and you're a child who goes into any hospital in this country for a routine surgery, the chance of you dying is 3 times higher from any cause after that surgery. The truth in that is irrefutable, and the strength of that is so powerful that it's amazing to me that we should be like wondering about how to navigate this. This should be the greatest priority of every healthcare system around. Can I get another amen on that? Because I think that we're talking about trying to struggle to move people in different ways to think about things, and this should be at the core, the deepest set of values, the deepest priorities. I've been spoiled by watching this nation create a brand new set of vaccinations within a year with incredible effectiveness and efficiency, and it makes me wonder, we can do that?
So then when you look at leaderships, the leadership at Seattle Children's probably isn't that fundamentally different than exists at a lot of other hospitals. Are there common mistakes that you would identify?
Yeah, I appreciate really hearing different folks in different spaces of leadership today already. The way this conversation has been organized is really, I think, genius in bringing a lot of different voices in different stages and places of leadership to bear. I used to be a little bit like, I don't want to talk about leadership so much. Maybe this is hippie mom, I don't know. But like, I want to, like, this got to be about the people and coming from up from the bottom and really welling up in our systems. But I've come to really, really appreciate the importance of leadership, the necessity of leadership, not just the privilege of the position of leadership, but the deepest obligations of leadership. And so I started to talk to you, I was thinking about this a little bit, and was writing a little bit, and I was starting to come up with these. When I think of the 7 deadly sins of leadership during times of racial crisis, when an issue of racism shows itself in your midst. And I want to mention them. You could, as leaders, you can all check off the list if you're feeling good about yourself in these spaces, but maybe there are other things to just keep in mind. I heard Dr. Taylor say the first one, which is that flowery words, the flowery words that have been coming up and posted and placed in every space since about 1.5 years ago, those are just words. Words have to actually speak to action and then must be accompanied by true action. We have created substitutes for action in our systems by putting nice words on websites, and that by itself cannot stand. Words without intention towards accountability, without investing, well, Dr. Taylor himself with the power to actually make the changes that his articulate and incredibly brilliant mind is seeing necessary. That words without accountability are just words, and we should not fall for that game anymore. That's one. The second, for the place where I was working, was it is both the crime and it is the cover-up. I will say again, the hospital I worked in knew 10 years ago that it was policing Black and brown families differently, and knew that and did nothing about it. And it became a pattern of covering up issues related to treatment again and again that I could expound on that would take too long, in ways in which there was knowledge actually about something that was wrong, and then a desire to actually cover it up and not talk about it. It is so true that the cover-up is as painful in many ways as the crime, and it's infuriating. It's one thing to do something harmful and not know that you're doing it. And then once you do know, you change. That's what humans are supposed to do. Organizations have a deeper obligation through leadership to make sure that when they recognize a harm, they don't go another decade continuing that harm with that knowledge. A third is about using blacks against blacks, Black and brown against Black and brown. One strategy this hospital used was to bring together an investigation by a very famous Black lawyer, Eric Holder, our former Attorney General. What it felt like at the time was that they were sort of bringing in one famous Black guy to kind of take on another less famous Black person's allegations. But we see this over and over again. Sometimes maybe there's an organization you know about where a person is hired, a Black or brown person is hired into a position to defend that organization, to help bolster the organization's reputation in defense of issues that the community, the Black community, the brown community is lifting up and raising up, placing a Black person in the line of fire from Black allegation. It's a tried and true split them and divide them kind of strategy. And it's hard sometimes to be the Black person hired into a position, brought into a space of demi-leadership, I'll call it, and know at first whether or not you are actually empowered to do the things that you're being asked to do, or whether you're just being trotted out there to be the defensive token in those spaces. Another leadership challenge is the issue of feeling threatened and listening to the wrong people whispering in your ear. There can be such a component of risk of exposure, credibility damage, financial damage, lawsuit, and things like that, that in times of crisis, when issues of racism are brought into institutions, it can be tempting to listen to the lawyers who will be whispering in your ear, to say, shore up, to say, don't admit anything, to say, don't acknowledge that, don't address that. If you address it, then it means you know that it was wrong, and that means you're at fault, and fault has a very specific set of legal components to it. And so that becomes really important to really think about who is whispering in your ear when you are in leadership and you're being in a place of addressing issues of racism. If you listen only to the lawyers and the risk management people, you'll be continuing to do harm to the communities and the people around you in order to protect something that's reputational and ephemeral and ultimately meaningless when your words are not matched by your actions. I'm getting close. Number 5 is never, ever underestimate community. Do not underestimate the power of Black community in particular. We are in communities that have incredible wisdom and wealth, even when in Seattle, for say, when redlining, which actually goes back to the 19-teens and earlier, was happening. Even out of that, we created an incredibly powerful community with jazz and art and expression and the people that you think of as national leaders in music. We were the second spot in the nation to have its Black Panther Organizational Center. We're a place of incredible education and arts and talent. We have a community that can mobilize and can take on any threat, has been surviving every threat for so long. When you underestimate Black community, you do so at your own peril. I say this to every hospital leader, every organizational leader, every board member out there. When you think that the power of your organization is more powerful than the beautiful Black power of the communities that I know of and that I've come from, you are due to fail. You are going to go down, or you will not survive that time. The 6th one is a hard one to say, but as a leader, you better not set up a system where you hide behind your patients when problems arise. When you start to say, why are you putting so much scrutiny on us about our issues of racism? We just want to get back to treating patients because that's what we do. When you start to say, this is about the kids if you're a children's hospital, this is about the patients, the mothers if you're a maternity service, and you try to place strategically patience between accountability and you, between community accountability and you, between the wrongs that you do and you, you are doing a deeper harm to the people that have entrusted you with the lives of their loved ones. Placing patients, placing children, placing those bodies between you and accountability is one of the deeper harms and the sins, I think, of this time. And finally, I will say, treating all of this, all of these issues of racism, of oppression, of difficulty, of challenge, treating all of that as if it were a PR issue and not a real issue. If you're part of a hospital system that is only thinking that we need to find what the right media message is to get past this, the right way to create the right campaign that will send the right message, rather than do the hard work of stepping back and being very deeply introspective, reflective, and doing the hard work of admitting, I've heard people sit up here and say, we did wrong today, and that is one of the most powerful things, and one of the hardest things I think sometimes for healthcare to acknowledge and to say out loud. As long as a hospital leader, a board member thinks that the issues of racism are PR issues and not people issues, you will continue to be a harmful institution. You will continue to convey that harm across the communities that you serve. So those are the 7 deadly sins that I'm learning about. You can tell I'm a pediatrician and not a writer or a poet, but what I'm saying is these are things that you see around you if you have experiences in the healthcare system. And I'll bet some of them sound similar in the journalistic world.
They are. I was going to say, in a lot of ways, there are a lot of similarities, but the common denominator is the racism, the systemic racism, which infiltrates all of our fields. I want to transition to solutions, but first, so you resign this position. You're now teaching pediatric medicine, correct?
Doing some teaching. I'm actually trying to start a center. It's called ASHE, and some of you will know exactly what that means. It's an acronym, though, and it is a center actually devoted in the short term, the next couple of years, to ending youth incarceration across all of across our county and our state, hopefully nationally. No greater health harm can be done to Black and brown communities than to incarcerate young people, to take them out of their lives, to create the idea and the image that they are criminals instead of learning and growing brilliant young people who have so much more to give to the world. So it is a health issue in my mind, and I'm starting a center that helps to amplify some of the efforts of the many great people, brilliant people in Black community and across other parts of our county and state that are doing great work to make sure that that happens. Ashe.
Ashe, okay. I want to circle back to that in just a second. I got to keep an eye on my time here.
All right.
See, here's the problem when you get like a
Into
news
it.
person
At
doing
the
this
fireside.
conversation. But I do want to circle back to this whole school to prison pipeline, which I don't think gets enough media attention. But I want to look at then your role as an educator.
Yeah.
Because you've identified these issues. You know what the problems in leadership are. As you then, and we've heard earlier about this shortage of Black and brown students in medical schools. What is your message to the students that you're gearing them up for this world that you know is problematic?
I have a few messages. One is first that I'm much more a student than a teacher to these students. And I imagine that anybody who's a good teacher is probably much more a student than a teacher in most of the work that you do. So I learn a lot from these students, especially Black students and brown students who are actually demanding a better world, not learning to suffer through a world and hope to get by, not hoping for some individual exceptionalistic kind of approach to ones or twos making it through a horrible gauntlet. Not even full of hopeful ideas and thoughts and sort of platitudes, but actually expecting a better world. Think about the power of that. So I need to be led by them in that message, because I was taught to survive and suffer. I was taught the twice as good. Raise your hand if you were taught the twice as good. I was taught how to make sure that I was outperforming, showing up better, speaking better, as a way to survive a system that was hostile to me. I am learning from students today who are expecting a better world that sees them for all of who they are. They don't like the idea of code shift. Raise your hand if you code shift in your work, if you have to change who you are and speak differently in some spaces than others. These students are bringing something else. There's no masks on. They're bringing a whole self. And I think that that's something that needs to be protected, loved, and uplifted. And sometimes in our paternalism for students, especially Black mentoring of Black students, I'll speak to that personally. It can be tempting to want to protect them, to want to say, hey, I had to do this, so you need to cool it. I would rather be in a world where that energy is lifted up, where they're leading me, they're telling me that I need to be working harder, they're telling me that I need to be trying harder. And I love that space. I'm inspired by students every single day. So I'm calling out maybe the gray hair folks with me to do what you can to lift them up and do whatever you can to get out of the way, because they are coming strong and they're going to change this world in ways that we can't even imagine.
So then that's the perfect segue into how do we fix this problem?
I think just one, I know we're short on time, so one sort of parting piece for me is to think about is the intersectionality of this all. I don't know using that word intersectionality around things like how many different identities sometimes we bring into spaces, how we even change identities in different spaces, how intersectional we all are. It kind of connects us to this work and makes it all important to all of us. There's a lot of intersections, though. I think there's intersectional harm. And I think in one way that when you find issues of racism, you actually find conditions of many other harms also. I think there's intersectional harm. I'm going to apologize to somebody for this later, but I'm going to think about the Texas legislature, where not only is the harm of actually suppressing voting rights being promulgated, but at the same time, suppressing reproductive rights of women. I think there's intersectional harm that it clusters together in similar spaces. And I think in a way, racism is a way to actually identify spaces that have many more harms going on. I think our Children's Hospital, for all the wonderful people there, also had a problem with mold in its ORs that it covered up for a long time. And I think that the harm that is happening there from one issue is related in some ways to the other harm too. I think there's intersectional harm, which means I think that there are a lot of intersectional solutions. And I think about the issue of the nursing shortage, which we are only on the beginning edge of seeing even deeper and deeper problems in the coming year, 2 years. There's some study that just came out that said that 49% of nurses currently expect themselves not to be working in 2 years. There's national data that says that there's 1 million nursing shortage today. So all we can see is that getting worse. I say that all because I actually think, in addition to the issues of salary, and sometimes the issues of dignity, and sometimes the issues of schedules and workloads, the solutions that come from being anti-racist, the ideas that come to you when you engage a community that's been harmed by racism for ideas that they have that are so much better than anyone else's ideas for how to solve it. The kinds of initiatives that you employ are the kinds of things that would make a nursing force want to come back, are the kinds of things that would make the nursing force work better and stronger, would make a much more resilient, much more powerful nursing force. The solutions that you use for anti-racism for just about any sector would actually amplify and address a lot of the challenges that are happening in just about every sector. So if we're losing brain trust, the wisdom of decades of nursing profession, the mind gap that's going to happen from losing those folks who've been there for 20 and 30 years too soon, we need to be really pulling as many strategies as we can. And I really believe what somebody said earlier, that the issues of racism are not just about racism, but they are integrated, they're intersectional with every other challenge that we see in our field. I think a hospital that's committed to addressing anti-racism is going to find its nursing force much more strongly present, strongly growing, strongly there, strongly diverse, strongly able to lead the way in changing the national conversation about how we treat our nurses in this country today.
We have about 2 minutes left, but I want to then, no.
Fireside, I was feeling all warm and cuddly.
Then looking at Ashe, looking at that concept, and this school to prison pipeline that exists across this country.
Like straight threads, like Deirdre's talking about.
Is the root of that racism as well?
Yes. I mean, it is planned and designed, and we can talk a lot about the social construct and the many different traumas that different communities might face, including BIPOC, Black and Brown and Indigenous communities face in terms of the trauma, but we cannot get away from the basic fact that 2 children, 1 Black, 1 white, with the very, very same behaviors, the same exact behaviors in pre-K, in preschool, are treated differently. One will be subject to discipline and one will not. That is a deeper issue than anything about socioeconomics, than anything about social determinants of health. That is about the deepest roots of racism at the very, very beginnings of the second teachers after your parents in the educational system. So yeah, that goes all the way back, all the way through to the beginnings.
It's kind of a drop the mic moment, because now I believe I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Conti, and she will add the other panelists to our conversation.
Well, thank you.
Thank
and again,
you.
thank you for
Thank you.
being invited.
We were late in our queue to get up here because we were all enraptured by this fireside chat, and we were just, there were snaps under the table, there were amens, there was clapping, and so I'm really excited to be able to have this distinguished panel to be able to carry on the conversation. Whenever we talk about racism, there's, sometimes this barrier that makes us not want to speak the truth, and I am so grateful that Lynne, you were able to bring out the truth in Dr. Danielson's story. And Dr. Danielson, thank you so much for being here and just to be able to talk plainly about the issues and what's going on. So we are just excited to have this amazing panel, and I'm just grateful that I get to, introduce and speak with you. So, of course, Dr. Danielson is here. Next to him, we have Liz Bennett, who is an elected official on our Allegheny County Council. I also have the privilege of working with her in the Black Equity Coalition. We have Dr. Jeanette Southpaw, who now runs, and I have to look at this, J. Southpaw Academic Consultants, but we all know and love her in Pittsburgh as Professor Emeritus, and she was the previous chair, so my chair before me, and also was the person that hired me to come to Pittsburgh. So thank you for coming to be here. We have Tammy Thompson, who is the executive director of Catapult Greater Pittsburgh. We didn't have an opportunity to speak, but I've heard just amazing things about you and your organization. And then last but not least, Dr. Conrad Smith, who is the director of Cardiac Catheterization Lab and associate chief for cardiovascular and cardiology for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also one of my colleagues working in the UPMC health disparity. So panel, thank you, and let's have a conversation about structural racism in healthcare. So I'd like to start out, I talked in my comments earlier about family medicine and the importance of community. So really starting out with, you being in the community, what do you see is the issue for health systems and where do we go?
Yes, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I think the previous panelists and speakers have really set this conversation up well and have sort of echoed a lot of the things that I say and think about on a regular basis. One of the things that we have to do is have these very intentional conversations. We have to address that institutional racism exists in every single system in this country. And as someone who is hyper-focused on poverty and creating solutions to address poverty, specifically in low to moderate income Black communities, healthcare and the lack of access to quality healthcare for a lot of different reasons is something that not only I talk to constituents and participants in our programs about, but that I have experienced myself as a Black woman who was born into very extreme generational poverty, raised all of my own children in extreme poverty, and a lot of what Dr. Cooper Owens was discussing hit me very, very hard. I remember very clearly what it felt like to feel the disdain that you see when you walk into a clinic as a single pregnant teenager, and also now as what people would consider a professional who makes decent money, and you would never be able to tell by looking at me what my economic stressors have been, but still be treated the same, still have those feelings that I don't know if I'm gonna get out of here alive. So I think we have to have these conversations. I think we have to start connecting poverty trauma and the trauma that comes with not getting your most basic needs met on a regular basis in every conversation that we have about equity.
Thank you for that. It just provides a great segue into my next question with you, Liv. And knowing that you're from Pittsburgh, you've had children. Tell me a little bit about your story and why it's important for this room to know.
So thank you, like Tammy said, for inviting me to this panel. Thank you for that question. So yes, like Tammy, I was a young mom. I was a mom at 15. I had my second child at 19. And when I had my second child, actually all my children, I had an African-American man gynecologist, Dr. Goodrich. And when I had my second child, he informed me that that would be the last delivery that he would be doing at Magee-Womens Hospital, because he was very, very unhappy with how Magee treated their African-American patients. And so in our pre-discussion, I said not too much has changed from 1998 in my experience with Magee. And, and I'm sharing this from now a mother watching her child give birth, and every single time my child is given birth at Magee, there has been an issue. Her second child, she actually almost died because the placenta was left in her. So again, there's a lot of work to be done, and I don't know that we're making a lot of movement. And I think that is the frustration of a lot of us as Black women in the healthcare system. We keep seeing the same thing being said over and over again, including in the 2019 Gender Equity Report. And yet, we still have these same experiences. So action is probably what we are calling for at this time.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Smith, hearing that and hearing the stories from our community and patients and their experience, and knowing that this equity report is out there, and we see that we as a healthcare system are not doing the things that we need to do. But then as a physician, what is our role? How do we make change? How do we make better outcomes for our patients?
Yeah, no, well, thanks, Tracey. Yeah, I think recognizing the problem, and I think it's staring us straight in the face. We have these examples that you both have so gratefully shared, and the report that was highlighted earlier, that we see that these 3 or 4 times the mortality rates in communities of color versus other communities. So we as physicians need to own that. We need to take care of our house first, in my estimation. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is to recognize that we all carry within ourselves some implicit bias, or there can be implicit bias. Some of those things that allow us, unconsciously allow us to treat patients of different colors in different ways, unfair treatment, and that's in part the source of a lot of disparities. And there's a great deal of data out there that shows that bias leads to worse outcomes, people not receiving the therapies that they need, placentas being left in place when they shouldn't be left in place, obviously. But by the same token, there are simple things that we can do as physicians, just the process of perspective taking, right? Putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes and understanding, trying to think that way when we deal with them. And that, again, with data to support that, we can eliminate or mitigate that implicit bias and move ourselves in the right direction. There's also a great deal of data with respect to ways that quality improvement programs. You know, in the field of cardiology, we have a lot of data how quality improvement helps in treating patients that have heart attacks, right? But we also see is there's been this dramatic and persistent difference in outcomes of Black patients with cardiovascular disease versus white patients. As we've gotten better over the last 40 years in treating those patients, the mortality rate has gone down, but there's been this very stubborn 40% difference in mortality, with Blacks dying more from heart disease. And what we have done in the studies within cardiology, simply by doing quality improvement processes, focusing on race as well, we've been able to eliminate that. To a certain degree. We've been able to give those patients the appropriate care that they need. So, and giving them that appropriate care eliminates the disparities that were present before that led to the biased outcomes. So I think those are just a couple of the things that I think that we can do as physicians. There are many more, including things that we've heard before with respect to the pipeline. I think that it's been mentioned a number of times how physicians of color have developed better relationships with their patients of color. Their patients are more compliant with their recommendations than when there is the discordance between race. That doesn't mean that you have to have a doctor that looks like you, but what it does suggest is that cultural competence is really a critical important of how we deal with patients. And for us to have that with our patients, whether there is this race discordance or not, will lead to better outcomes. So for us to work, to learn, to share what we know with our colleagues, and to grow as a group of physicians so that we can better understand the needs of the patients. And part and parcel with that is the pipeline piece. So building the pipeline, there are not enough physicians of color to treat the communities that we serve.
I'm reminded of a saying that my young teenage kids say less, right? Dr. Southpaw, you've heard this conversation, you heard from a physician's standpoint. What about from a system? I mean, you have seen systems before you came to Pittsburgh, you've left Pittsburgh and seen other systems. How do we as a health system move forward?
It's so important for us to think about how and what we measure. Because so often we realize if we don't pay attention to the things we don't measure. And yet historically we have developed metrics that are based on things that don't take culture, race, discrimination, or history into account. We tend to count what's easy to count. What's easy to count is not necessarily the most important or describe the entirety of what's going on. And so I think that first of all, we're going to have to start re-looking at our metrics and assuring ourselves that we are not missing important metrics. And that requires listening to our patients. And not only listening, but sharing what we've heard with others. And I think about a patient that for years, many people know I did deliveries at Magee. And I had one young woman who stays prominent on my mind because she came to my retirement luncheon at the Tice Health Center. And I remember delivering her early on, and she said, you know, I need to know that you will be there with me when I go into labor. And I said, well, I'll do my best, but I can't guarantee. No, I need you to tell me and promise me. I said, well, you know, sometimes I travel. And she says, but you gave me a due date. I said, I know, I did give you a due date, but you know, it's not always the perfect date. She says, if you aren't there when I get there, I'm leaving. I'm not gonna stay. Because the only way I know I'll get good care is if you're there with me, because then they'll realize I'm important. And I realized then that she says, because I know what happens, I get there and I'm just some other black face. And I need them to know I'm important. And I think that the thing we have to keep in mind is that when you have been traditionally disadvantaged, you no longer feel special. You no longer feel important. And that contributes to this fear, this lack of trust, these depressive symptoms that you have that then, as Dr. Danielson talks about, all of a sudden changes the narrative and makes you the criminal because you are responding more hysterically or these sorts of things. And I think I would extend that to say, if we do this for the least of us, everyone benefits. There's a wonderful book out by Heather Magee called The Sum of Us. And that book is just, it challenges you. Because what she says as an African-American attorney who headed a CEO of a corporation for a while, she says, we as a country have created a history where after World War II, we realized that we needed to embrace all of those who had served the nation. Many of you know I'm a veteran, so I'm used to the spirit of service. And lots of things were started, veterans benefits, veterans loans, community organizations and benefits, pools in communities like St. Louis and Montgomery, Alabama, where Sims came from, as we heard when we were talking to Dr. Owens Cooper was mentioning. And all of these things were part of federal legislation paid for by the taxes all of us pay for, all of us contribute to. However, people don't realize it was only for white people. It's only for white people. And when aggressive vocal African American communities said, we should be able to swim in that pool in St. Louis. We should be able to swim in that pool in Montgomery, Alabama. Rather than, I'd say, the least painful thing would have been set aside different times. Okay, black people can go from 10 to 12, and white people can go from 1 to 3 or so. They elected to fill these pools up with cement and dirt so that no one benefited. So I think we have to step back and think about when we attend to these structural differences and issues, and we do it in such a way that the least of us can benefit, all of us benefit. Because if you walk in and you may not have dark skin, but you're different, something about you. You may have a hijab or a niqab on you. You may be Orthodox Jewish, or you may speak with an accent. For whatever that difference is, you get less. But if we think of everybody as deserving it, then as Heather Magee says, the sum of us is we all benefit.
Her book is amazing. I'm in the middle of it. It's an audiobook. I had the privilege of listening to the AAMC, and she spoke, and just talking about tackling it and starting to begin. And so that would be my question for you, Dr. Danielson. Where do we start?
Well, this concept of, it's spoken about sometimes as targeted universalism is such a powerful theme. I think it makes us recognize that a lot of the time, both the interventions that happen in healthcare and maybe the way society is constructed in general is one that it tends most to the most privileged and layers it from there on down. And even when we try to do interventions to solve for issues of disparity, we often make them so that the least disparaged can move up, but not actually truly beneficial for everyone. So the targeted universal approach is really powerful. The curb cut that's really focused on a person with a disability that requires a wheelchair is also beneficial to the elder who's getting across the street a little more slowly, also beneficial to the mother and father pushing a stroller getting across the street, also beneficial for me who might jaywalk going to the corner. So the benefit to everybody from interventions that are really focused on those who are most disenfranchised, that by itself, if that were a piece, then I think would be extremely effective at making big changes. And the second thing I'll say really quickly is we have to break a little bit out of our deficit-based framing, and we have to start talking more about abundance and brilliance. And I started asking people in meetings and discussions and project meetings and things like that to start their sentences with, based on what we know about the brilliance of black communities, we should ... And when you do it that way, when you think that way, you just think so differently than based on the horrible death rate, based on the deficits, based on the lack of economic empowerment. Like if we see brilliance, at least as part of that equation, I think we'd do things so much differently.
Yes. So with that, I'd like to ask the entire panel, what are those things that we can tangibly do as a health system to combat racism? What are those positives that we need to focus on to be able to do this work?
I'll jump in and just say, in addition to addressing racism, we also have to make sure we are not leaving out classism, because classism is also playing a part in finding solutions to these problems of inequity. I think we, to Dr. Danielson's point, speaking to the folks in the communities that we want to improve, having them at the table when we are coming up with solutions, getting their feedback so that we have accurate information about their experiences, listening to their stories, listening to the anecdotal data that exists in addition to the medical data. I'm not a doctor. I have no letters behind my name, but I have a lifetime of experiences associated with being a black woman who had to work really, really hard to escape poverty. And there's a lot of trauma attached to that. A lot of that trauma has connections to the medical field: depression, anxiety, hypertension, higher risk of heart attack and stroke. These are not as a lot of people would like to think because of bad diet or I just didn't take care of myself. It is literally because of the extreme stress and trauma associated with just trying to survive. And so I think if we are adding that type of data to the solution solving, we have to get folks at the table who can tell their story and be accurate about what we are experiencing in our communities.
So I will also jump in and say, and kind of toggling off of you and talking about intersectionality in the problems, and if you see one problem, then oftentimes there's another one, and then tagging off of you at classism. We can't talk about the external problems of a health system without talking about their internal customers as well, which are their workers. I have not been fortunate enough yet to escape poverty. I still live in low-income housing. I am still struggling in poverty. And there are many like me who work in these health systems that are struggling in poverty as well. And so when we're talking about solutions, we also need to be talking about rising those folks up in the system as well, paying them a fair wage, paying them a living wage. There's no reason why we can't do that, especially in this health system that's bringing in trillions of dollars. So I just wanted to make sure that that was also talked about and tagging off of both of your statements.
I think another thing that I think is so important is for us to, as leaders, to demand accountability. So often, you know, I've taught courses at both at the medical student level, the master's level, all, and where we sit down and we try to train everybody to be culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate. There are often one or two individuals that misbehave, and they misbehave regularly. So then we do group therapy. We punish everybody and we tell them they need to stay later so that we can educate them all. But we don't pull aside the individuals who have been creating particularly toxic situations. And I think that's what we have to do as leaders. We have to say, what you did was unacceptable. And you need to work on yourself, work with somebody else. And then embrace those who have done a good job, and then identify those who haven't. That's the accountability that has to come at the system level to make a change.
Yeah, and I'll just echo points that have been made. Essentially, you know, we need to go to the community and listen to them and try to build the trust so that we can work together with them to find solutions that are appropriate and fitting for their communities.
Dr. Danielson.
Just loving hearing all of this. I'm full Ashe land myself, but I think that there's a way in which we disempower ourselves sometimes in these conversations too. We say, I'm not in the right place in the hierarchy, I'm only one person, these problems are too big. And I just hope we can create different narratives about what we can do, what we are able to do, where we can start. Any journey begins with those first steps. Not imagining every calorie that's burned all the way in that 1,000-mile journey, but what it takes to take those first steps. So we should be thinking about what we can do a lot more than what we can't do.
All right. Well, thank you so very much to all of our panelists, and thank you for engaging in this conversation.